Ahoy, and welcome. This is Admiral. A lesser-known detail of Age of Empires history is that after the success of the original Age of Kings, a certain historical empire was a top contender originally considered to be added as a civilization with the Conqueror's expansion, but was deferred due to pressure from executives to add the Koreans instead, in an attempt to capture the Korean market where StarCraft had been very successful. This civilization was also considered for the Forgotten Empires mod, but was also deferred. Since then, that civilization has become an extremely popular fan request, regularly ranking at the top of polls for its region and globally, and appearing in many dozens of fan concepts and several mods over the years. The civilization I'm referring to is, of course, actually three civilizations representing a trio of warring factions, seen through the filter of a 14th century novel that existed as such for an interdynastic period of several decades before uniting to form a fourth, existing civilization. Longtime fans with any level of exposure to online communities will surely have stumbled across a wealth of fan civilization designs featuring the famous Shu war chariots with stormtrooper accuracy, regenerating Wuskarls, and polls asking for the legendary Wei soldiers that generate food via photosynthesis as they stand around.
No way!
No, of course the civilization I'm talking about is the Bödpa, or Tibetans, the Forgotten Empire ironically forgotten by Forgotten Empires to this day. Now, to be fair, there has long been the specter of possible censorship if Tibet were to be added officially, although I have seen enough of what we can loosely call counter-evidence to be personally convinced that that fear is greatly overstated. But of course, I don't have all the information relevant to making that decision, nor am I in a position to make it. So I expect that Microsoft will continue to play it safe, even if I find that rather gormless. In any case, it's up to the modders, at least for the time being, so without further ado, I present my playable civilization concept for the Tibetans, which you can find on the Steam Workshop. The civilization is mainly focused on the Imperial period, although with some elements arguably more reflective of the later Buddhist Renaissance, and representing a few other areas such as Bhutan and Ladakh that were connected with or highly influenced by medieval Tibet. I won't go too deep into the history here except as it relates to the civilization design, since I like to keep my videos on the shorter side and focus on unique content you won't find elsewhere. But the elevator pitch for why the Tibetan Empire is a fitting addition for AoE2 is as follows. Starting in the early 600s AD, Songtsen Gampo finished his father's work by consolidating several warring Tibetan kingdoms and began to conquer adjacent territories. He also oversaw the introduction of Buddhism and the creation of the Tibetan script, moved the capital to Lhasa, married a Nepalese and a Chinese princess, and began an imperial era that would last for around 200 years and bring a large landmass under Tibetan control. High notes of the Tibetan Empire include occupying the Tang Chinese capital of Chang'an, capturing important fortresses in the Tarim Basin that controlled Silk Road routes and gaining significant wealth therefrom, racking up impressive wins on the battlefield, and accumulating knowledge from many of the greatest minds of their time, inviting scholars and physicians from India, China, Persia, Nepal, the Turkic regions of Central Asia, and even Byzantium to conferences at Samye, and translating many of their works into Tibetan. In short, on top of being on top of the world, medieval Tibet was a major military power and experienced a notable cultural and economic florescence as displayed in splendid monasteries or gompas, bountiful pastures, and towering mountain fortresses. Even after the decline and dissolution of the empire cascading from the assassination of the last Dharma king, Rinpoche, in 838 AD, the splintered Tibetan regions maintained autonomy for several hundred more years. While that marked the end of their imperial ambitions, they eventually experienced a major religious and economic revival and became a haven for pilgrims and a place of patronage for foreign monks facing instability or conquest in their own lands. When the mighty Mongol Empire came knocking in 1240 AD, the Tibetan kingdoms no longer had the unity or military might to resist annexation, and eventually submitted to Mongol rule without too much trauma. Tibetan monks came to wield considerable influence within the Mongol court, and even managed to the great Kublai Khan to Tibetan Buddhism. So if anyone was looking for stories to tell, the Tibetans can offer quite a few good ones.
There were some big stories that we wanted to tell with this DLC, and I'm sorry for the fuzziness on the reply.
In terms of gameplay, they represent a unique opportunity for a new pastoral civilization with an infantry, cavalry, and monk focus, on top of a credible defensive theme and a unique architecture set. With that introduction, let's get into the civilization design, starting with their bonuses. First off, let's note that Tibetans have pastures instead of farms. I haven't listed this as a civilization bonus, as it would no longer be a fully unique feature, and regional replacements aren't typically listed as civilization bonuses as they were back in ancient times. But their first actually unique bonus is that hunters, herders, and shepherds generate gold while working. This was an obvious bonus for a civilization where pastoralism and hunting represented a huge chunk of the subsistence and commercial economies, and I think it fits Tibetans particularly well. A wordy but descriptive title for herdsmen in Tibet is Rakang Ich Noldan, literally meaning possessor of four-legged riches, and many other words or expressions for general wealth or property derived from terms referring to yaks and other herd animals. The yak in particular provided a variety of resources in meat, wool, leather, sinew, and fuel, while also serving as beasts of burden.
I haven't even mentioned all the free yak's milk.
But these items weren't valued exclusively by the Tibetans themselves. Yak tails and wool were notable medieval exports, and even today yak bone is prized for uses in traditional medicine. The Tibetans also exported horses, particularly to China along what became known as the Tea Horse Road. They also exported skins from hunted animals, and especially musk from the musk deer, which was a must-have for perfume lovers and was sought after and famous enough to be mentioned by Marco Polo among other medieval authors. And Tibetan musk continued to be in high demand well into the modern era. As for how this manifests in my civ design, hunted animals provide the lion's share of the early gold, and herd animals, including those in pastures, provide 1/3 as much gold. A map generation with 2 boars, 4 deer, and 8 sheep will yield about 150 gold, although it will be a bit less than that if there are only 3 deer or if there are chickens instead. And of course, animals lost to laming will reduce that amount, and maps with more hunt will provide more potential gold. This is a very powerful early bonus that lends itself well to a drush, or especially an archer rush. On a closed map, it could even be used for a fast castle without having to mine gold if there are 4 deer, which might be too strong, but I'll risk it. Once the available animals are exploited, the bonus persists in a weak form for herders on a pasture, who continue to garner gold at a rate that maxes out at about 83% of what Burgundian farmers get after their vineyard's unique technology, but of course without needing to research anything. The next bonus is that armor upgrades provide +5 hit points on top of their existing effect. As with the pasture bonus, the affinity for armor is built into the language and expressions itself. As an ancient Tibetan expression for power, Dburmog Tsanpo means having a strong helmet. Tibetan armor was famously effective and admired by many of their neighbors, some of whom used Tibetan armor themselves. During the siege of the Arab fortress of Kamarja in 729 by a Turkic confederation called the Turgesh Kagan, Suluk, is recorded as having been hit several times by Arab archers, but survived with only a mild injury because he was wearing Tibetan armor. The Chinese historian Du Yo also spoke of Tibetan armor in glowing terms as follows, in a way that almost sounds like a Tibetan version of a cataphract or prototype of the Jurchen Iron Pagoda. He says, "The men and horses all wear chainmail armor. Its workmanship is extremely fine. It envelops them completely, leaving openings only for the 2 eyes. Thus strong bows and sharp swords cannot injure them." So it makes some sense for AoE2 Tibetans to have tanky soldiers. There was even a famous historical exchange between the Tang general Su Dingfang and the son of the Tibetan general Gar Tongsten, in which the Chinese general boasted of the number of troops at his command, while the Tibetan emphasized the quality of their soldiers, comparing the Tibetan army to a hawk that could devour many small birds. Back to gameplay, and combining the armor discussion with a preview of affected units in their barracks, range, and stables, this makes any of your feudal age units a bit tankier once you research their armor upgrade, including archers. In Castle Age, the Tibetan archer line dead ends for balance, and to a lesser extent, historical reasons. To revisit the work of the historian Du Yo, he says, "Their archery is weak, but their armor is strong." So my Tibetan's concept features a lack of the final ring archer armor, as well as crossbowmen for the aforementioned balance reasons, and to avoid overshadowing the Vietnamese bonus for foot archers. Not that Tibetans were terrible archers by any means, and they do at least have usable cavalry archers. But in this particular history, the Chinese source wasn't too impressed with the performance of their bows.
Most impressive.
And I couldn't find a counter-narrative that established highly effective archery in a battlefield context, although within Tibetan culture it is considered an important weapon. Tibetans of course use the bow in warfare, and doubtless to some effect, but not nearly to the level of power and mastery achieved by the Mongols, Jurchens, Turks, or others. Among other things, it seems that their bows were somewhat smaller and less capable of higher draw weights than these later bows. However, there is a lot of evidence, both direct and circumstantial, for powerful Tibetan infantry and cavalry, and of course strong armor generally, and these seem to have been the features that impressed even their enemies. Back to the tech tree, Tibetans do have robust skirmishers, and switching into cavalry archers can be viable considering they have up to 10 extra hit points. Infantry are a bit stronger as well in Castle Age, but still not quite on par with Vikings, and note that Tibetans don't get the new Fire Lancer or any other gunpowder units. However, they do have access to Steppe Lancers, and do get Bloodlines, but not Husbandry. I also gave them the Heiguang Cavalry instead of Nightline, which can benefit especially from the extra armor hit points bonus. In Imperial Age, they get Heavy Cavalry Archers, although missing Parthian Tactics and Ring Armor. Their Champions are solid with 15 extra hit points, close to Viking Champions but without the Chieftain's boost, and their Pikemen are similarly tanky and similarly lacking the Halberdier upgrade. Moving on to the Imperial Age stable, they technically missed the Hussar upgrade, but their Light Cavalry have Hussar hit points after the 15 hit point boost from researching all the armor texts. Their Heavy Heiguang Cavalry are fairly strong, as well as their Elite Steppe Lancers, which have almost as many hit points as Mongol Lancers and more armor, but are slower due to missing Husbandry. The next civilization bonus is a unique building at the Goomba that combines the monastery and university among other things. For many medieval peoples, there was far less separation between spiritual and secular learning than today, if any, and monasteries or their equivalents were central to education and the accumulation and preservation of knowledge. Perhaps nowhere was this more true than in Tibet, where large gompas often featured extensive libraries and were part of larger compounds forming a campus. Medieval Tibetans invited famous religious teachers, physicians, and other knowledge specialists from India, China, and other surrounding regions to share their expertise. As you might expect, the gompa is more expensive than either building, and also has a larger foundation, while combining their build time. The cost is 300 wood, which is 125 more expensive than a standard monastery and 100 more than a fortified church, but saving 75 wood relative to building both a monastery and a university. And for the purposes of age advancement like a castle, it does count as 2 Castle Age buildings. It also works somewhat faster than a typical university or monastery by 15% and has more hit points. You can see here that the first page has your typical monastery offerings, and you simply go to the next page to research university texts, which will be put in queue. The final major characteristic of this building is that it can garrison all non-siege units, and heals more quickly than a castle, but not as quickly as the fortified church, which is extremely constrained by only being able to garrison monks and villagers. As with the fortified church, garrisoned villagers or ranged units can fire arrows. The final civilization bonus is that Gompa technologies are 33% more effective, so they get a little more out of most available monastery and university technologies than other civilizations. Obviously, this doesn't apply to technologies with binary effects like Redemption that just flip the on switch for building and siege conversion, but it does improve anything that increases stats. For example, instead of 15 hit points and 15% movement speed from Sanctity and Fervor, they get 20 and 20%. This doesn't make their monks amazing out of the gate, but their power grows with each affected upgrade to make them the most well-rounded monks in late game. It also affects herbal medicine, making all their garrisonable buildings, and especially the Gompa, medical mega centers. The second page of the Gompa, or university technologies, are affected as well, meaning masonry and architecture provide a somewhat larger increase in building hit points, and +1 building armor each. Arrow slits adds 1 more damage to keeps, and treadmill crane improves construction rates by almost 27%. The historical inspiration for the monk theme is pretty obvious, and though Tibetans weren't always Buddhists, that was a very important religion for the nobility for most of the imperial period, and obviously during the later Buddhist Renaissance. Apart from importing scholars and monks as we talked about earlier, many Tibetan monks and physicians, such as the great Yuthog Yontan Gonpo the Elder, went abroad to study and collect texts to bring back to Tibet. Tibetan monks of course impressed Kublai Khan, and Marco Polo mentions Tibet as having the best enchanters and astrologists in all that quarter of the world. On a related note, their team bonus is that monks have +2 healing range, and can fire arrows when garrisoned in a defensive building. So with the civilization and team bonuses covered, now let's move on to the unique unit and unique technologies. Their unique unit is a cavalry unit that I've just called Gardepon, referring to a chief or leader of a military camp. It's a highly armored unit in line with the regular and heavy Heiguang cavalry, and with a couple extra features. It's also kind of expensive, but intended to provide high value. Its first ability is that it's immune to armor ignoring attacks, meaning that it only takes the standard damage minus armor from the latest Dravidian Woot Steel units and the composite bowman. That's a pretty small category of units, so I also gave it 0.5 range as a semi-step lancer, and the ability to plunder food from enemy buildings, especially farms, and at a more generous rate than the Keshik's gold plundering ability. The Tibetans in their Imperial era famously eschewed large-scale supply trains to provision their armies, preferring to live off the land, whether or not that land belonged to them, as much as possible. Christopher Beckwith, in his book on the Tibetan Empire, mentions one example of this where in a certain region, the Tibetans would regularly wait around the Chinese border until harvest time, when the Chinese grain was ripe, and then use their mobility to raid specifically to collect the grain. He says, the Tang authorities were so helpless to stop this from happening every year that the local Chinese nicknamed the area the Tibetan Grain Estates. The Castle Age unique technology is Brokpa, literally meaning pasture people, highlanders, or nomads. And in the modern day, Brokpa or Drokpa can refer to the profession of yak herders in Tibet and Bhutan, as well as to highland ethnic groups that have traditionally had that occupation. The tech adds 45 food to a pasture for each animal present, and for a bit of visual flavor, also updates the animal graphics. Unfortunately, we don't yet have an official yak graphic, so water buffaloes will have to do for now. It also expands the size of the central drop-off hub to the 2x2 tiles that it appears to be, rather than the 1x1 square that it otherwise is, making your herders somewhat more efficient, although they are still capped by the herder's maximum theoretical gather rate of about 25 food per minute. Finally, this technology allows you to train the light cavalry and cavalry archer lines from your pastures. While yaks were the most important source of food and other animal products, horse breeding was also an important occupation of the pasture people, especially in the Qinghai or Amdo region, and some of the hunting and herding skills of those people could be and were repurposed for mounted warfare. Note that the pasture's work rate is only 40% of that of a stable or archery range, or in other words, that it takes 5 pastures to match the production rate of 2 stables or ranges before conscription. So this tech offers wood savings in the long term as your pastures have more food, boosts worker efficiency a little, and provides the flexibility of training light cavalry and cavalry archers. The Imperial Age unique technology is called Tumkar. Tu means higher, upper, or the top part of something, and corresponds to the first syllable in the word Tibet. And Makar means a walled city, fortress, or castle. So you could render Tumkar as high castle. Some of the earliest references to Tibet and Proto-Tibetans mention the contrast between pastoralists and nomads, and strongholds and towers upon the hills and against the mountainsides, with even some of the houses being fortress-like and many-storied. With an obvious parallel to another civilization and region that is already represented in AoE2. In addition to obvious references to Tibetan fortifications, temples, and towers, you can also consider the high fortress technology as a metaphor for Tibet generally, composing part of an area known as the Roof of the World, a very difficult area for invaders to subdue. Given their enviable vantage points, I had to give them some kind of bonus for having the high ground.
It's over, Anakin! I have the high ground!
As such, this technology combines smaller versions of the Georgian defensive elevation boost and the Tatar offensive elevation boost, so that all Tibetan units and buildings deal 15% more damage to enemies, and take 10% less damage from enemies when they have the elevation advantage. On top of that, all units and buildings become more watchful with an additional 2 line of sight.
Always mind your surroundings.
This is definitely not the strongest Imperial Age tech, especially on Arena, but it should be worth your while on more topographically exciting maps. I don't think they needed anything too crazy, given at this point they've had time to stack up the advantages of their more rewarding technologies, and can access strong cavalry, solid infantry, outstanding monks, and more durable buildings. And any likely weakness to powerful siege or cavalry archer civilizations at this point would be more a feature than a bug. There are a couple more loose ends to tie up that we'll breeze through pretty quickly as we've already covered almost everything, but here are the remaining details. The siege workshop is quite poor, lacking bombard cannons, and lacking all units or technologies with siege in the name, besides the ever-situational siege tower. The blacksmith is nearly complete, but misses ring armor, and as you would expect, the dock is quite terrible. Even though at one point the Tibetan Empire did reach the Bay of Bengal, they really weren't known for their shipbuilding. At the castle, they miss sappers and hoardings, partially compensated, of course, by their more effective Goomba upgrades, and Imperial Age unique technology. And they are missing some important late-game economic technologies, namely two-man saw and both of the Castle Age mining upgrades. To round out the design, the Tibetans would of course speak classical Tibetan, and should absolutely have a new architecture set. And their wonder would be the Samya Monastery. And here is a list of their AI leader names. I don't have time to give justice to a campaign overview, although Robbie Lava has a Tibetan build that touches on that, and among other mods, I know that the Mandate of Heaven creators are working on a Tibetan campaign, so by all means check those out. So that's my Tibetan Civilization concept for Age 2, and if it looks like your cup of yak's milk or butter tea, you can check it out here. On the one hand, I acknowledge that it may be a bit loaded design-wise, but I really wanted to try to capture the feel of the Empire, and cutting any of the features just didn't feel right. I also think that for better or for worse, and at worst, it's on par with the new DLC Civilization designs, and even a little more restrained in some ways. Of course, any feedback is welcome. Love it, hate it, want to censor it, let me know. This has been me talking about my take on the Tibetans, how they took on the Tang, the Turkic tribes, the Tarim Basin trade, and tons of tomes of tales too long to tell. Till next time.